Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the National Farm to School Network Resource Roundup. We're going to give it just 1 moment for everyone to join the line and then we'll get started. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the National Farm to School Network Resource Roundup. Today we'll be discussing resources for advancing state farm to school and ECE strategies. I'm Lacey Stevens and I'm a program manager with the National Farm to School Network, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping reminders. This webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing in the National Farm to School Network resource database. You'll also receive a link to access that recording in a follow-up email, as well as links to the resources shared from our speakers today. Also, all attendees are in listen-only mode. As you do have questions, please feel free to enter those into the question box in your control panel. And I encourage you to enter those questions throughout the presentations and as they come to you. And we'll address those questions with our panelists at the end of the session today. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to our other upcoming webinars. We do have a monthly Trending Topics webinar. Coming up in June, that webinar will be focused on child nutrition reauthorization and federal policy advocacy, how you can get involved. And then in July, we have our Trending Topics webinar focused in farm to early care and education state strategic planning. And those are Thursday, June 7th and Thursday, July 11th, respectively. And you'll receive a link to register for those webinars in that follow-up email, and it's also accessible. Registration is accessible on the National Farm to School Network website. To get us started today, again, my name is Lacey Stevens, Program Manager with the National Farm to School Network, and I'll be introducing you to the National Farm to School Network, as well as sharing two of our recently updated resources, the State Farm to School Network's Toolkit and State Farm to School Positions Guide. And I'll be joined by my colleague Chloe Marshall, who is the National Farm to School Network Policy Specialist, who will be joining us to discuss the newly released Farm to School Policy Handbook. Chloe will be joined by two special guests and co-authors of the Policy Handbook from the Vermont Law School Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, or CAFS. CAFS provides students with an opportunity to apply their legal training, working with clients and project partners at the state, regional, and national level to develop legal tools and policy recommendations for stakeholders across the food system. Esther Akweyi is an LLM fellow with the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. She's a lawyer by training and has previously worked with smallholder farmers, addressing policy issues related to the right to food, climate change, land tenure, and natural resource governance. Sophie Krzyzewski is the clinical director at Vermont Law School CAFS. Prior to work at CAFS, Sophia was a senior policy specialist with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition in Washington, D.C., where she worked extensively on a range of federal policy, including the Farm Bill and the Food Safety Modernization Act. We look forward to hearing from Chloe, Sophia, and Esther later in the presentation. To get us started, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, I'd like to introduce you to the National Farm to School Network. The National Farm to School Network is an information, advocacy, and networking hub for communities working to bring local food sourcing, gardens, and food and agriculture education into schools and early care and education settings. Our network includes national staff and advisory board, nearly 200 core and supporting partner organizations across the country, and more than 20,000 network members. I invite you to learn more about our network structure, as well as find partners in your state on the Our Network page at farmtoschool.org. The National Farm to School Network works to advance farm to school and early care and education as a movement by focusing on our three core function areas, and that's acting as a hub for information, networking, and advocacy. So for us, that means connecting people to resources, people to people, and people to advocacy. And as we discuss these three resources today, we'll be linking back to these core functions, as well as how they link back to our strategic plan. So in the National Farm to School Network 2017 to 19 strategic plan, we identified priority areas to support the advancement of the movement and work within those core function areas. And that first priority is around expanding and refining policy advocacy programs and partnerships to institutionalize farm to school and ECE. And one of those niche areas within that priority we'll be focusing on today, and that's building capacity for advancement at the state level through state level positions, state level policies, and state level networks. So those three strategies are what we've honed in on as really vital to that advancement and institutionalization of farm to school and ECE at those state levels, and thus growing the national movement. So those three areas of networks, positions, and policy, we've developed resources to help support those, and those are the three resources we'll be honing in on today. The State Farm to School Networks Toolkit, the State Farm to School Positions Guide, and the State Farm to School Policy Handbook. So the first resource we'll start to dig into is around the State Farm to School Networks Toolkit. So mirroring the National Farm to School Network's success in growing the farm to school movement at the national level through collaborative network building, we've honed in on the state farm to school networks as that vital opportunity for growth and institutionalization of farm to school at the state level. State farm to school networks are really key to bringing together those diverse stakeholders and sectors that create a unified voice and allow the opportunity to set priorities and unified priorities at the state level to propel the movement. These state level networks are also really key to propelling those other state strategies that we'll be talking around positions and policies as well. So in this state networks toolkit, we've identified where those active state networks are. And as of March, in the publication of this issue of the resource, over 32 states across the country have active state farm to school networks that you can see depicted in this graphic here. So the aim of this resource is to both identify and share the number and reach of those state level networks, and also to provide insights and promising practices around network development and activity. So in this tool, you'll find general network development resources to help support those general and basic getting started opportunities around network development. We share what we've heard from states across the country who have these networks about what those seeds of success or those key elements of success for a state network are. We also look into in-depth case studies from several states to give insight into the successes and challenges of robust state network models. So what we see from our partners and in this resource is that we know that just like farm to school, state network development is not a one-size-fits-all model, but there are some promising practices that continue to come up as we talk to our partners about what's worked for their state network models. So while each state farm to school network is really unique, they generally share many of these promising practices that facilitate growth at the state level and then in turn support that national level movement building around farm to school. So those 6 seeds that we heard continually from our partners are identifying and engaging their stakeholders, establishing a robust network structure, setting that unified strategic vision and direction for the network and for the state movement. Also raising awareness, so increasing engagement around folks who don't have that awareness yet around farm to school. That advocating to advance and institutionalize the movement. So that relates back to that other state strategy that we've identified around policy movement and the intersection between these state strategies. And then finally, developing a shared metrics and evaluating impact. So look collectively at what the network has accomplished and where the opportunities are to proceed together as a collective coordinated network. So in addition to diving into these 6 seeds of success and looking at tips and tools for executing those practices, the resource also features case studies from Vermont, California, and Mississippi about the process, opportunities, approaches, and challenges that have worked and what our partners have learned from the process in these 3 states. So a big thank you to these partners for sharing their stories of success and their approaches to overcoming challenges. One of the final sections of this resource is really looking to analyze what we've learned from both those case studies and feedback from the partners around those challenges and future opportunities for state farm to school and ECE networks. So some of the challenges, and also sharing some of the approaches to overcoming these challenges, include looking and addressing issues around collaborative fundraising, which can be a challenge for groups working together, and also how to approach the network building in a sustainable way that can ensure the network goes beyond a single institution or goes beyond a single initiative and project and works to sustain the movement for many years to come. And as for the future of the future opportunities and interests in farm-to-school state networks, we anticipate that investment in farm-to-school state networks and the interest to continue to grow. And as those networks mature, we'll have even more opportunity to learn about the promising practices of state networks and more opportunity for states to learn from one another as we have more states engaging in this network building and development. So that's our first key resource. And again, as you have questions about these resources or about the development of state networks, please feel free to enter those into the question and answer box, and we'll have plenty of time to respond to questions at the end of the session. But I want to move on to our next resource, the State Farm-to-School Positions Guide. So in response to the growing demand for farm-to-school guidance and leadership, many states have developed these state coordinator positions. Often those positions are housed in state agencies or university extension offices. And those coordinator positions really give a lot of opportunity to support state-level farm-to-school activities and relationship development, to help to guide that state work movement building and often network building. And they can also offer that state level leadership and coordination that other entities or other programmatic persons don't necessarily have the opportunity to take time to work on the coordination level. In addition to that coordination level, many of these organizations and positions also offer that training, technical assistance, and educational opportunities and programming that facilitate the farm-to-school and early care education implementation at that programmatic level. So just as we've looked and seen growth and opportunity in federal level agency positions through the USDA Office of Community Food Systems, we really see the vital importance of the sustaining and growing the state level positions to help move the growth at the state level as well. So what do we see? At the time of this publication, we found that there are 155 positions within state agencies and extension across the United States. And you can see within this beautifully colored map a little depiction of where those are housed within the Departments of Agriculture, Health, Education, as well as university extension locations. 48 of those positions are full-time, so 29 full-time positions within state agencies and 19 full-time positions within extension across the country, which is just a really exciting development to see the number of people who are able to devote so much time to the development and execution and institutionalization of farm-to-school and farm-to-early care and education. In this tool, what we offer within this tool is an opportunity to support increasing the number of state farm-to-school positions within state agencies and university extensions. So this resource includes information to strategically advocate for the creation of more of these positions, including insight into the process of the position creation and the benefits of the role to be able to share internally and at the state level. In this resource, farm-to-school stakeholders will find a listing of existing state farm-to-school positions, both in state agencies and university extension, 4 case studies within 4 different states of different positions, an analysis of the current landscape around state farm-to-school positions, as well as sample job descriptions from some of the positions that are featured in the resource. Some of the key tools in this guide are these case studies, which really bring to life the process and approaches to establishing and sustaining these positions and the opportunities for these positions and how they can contribute to the growth of the farm-to-school movement at the state level. Again, a big thank you to our partners in Oregon, Minnesota, Missouri, and South Carolina for sharing their stories of their position development and their stories and opportunities of success. A final key element within this resource is the analysis portion, which provides insight into the current state of positions, so the locations, in which state agencies these positions are housed, and the breakdowns of those full-time equivalents. It provides insights into how these positions are created, funded, and importantly maintained, and how to maximize the role to secure this position over time. So that is a brief look into our state position resource. As you have questions, again, please enter those into the question box. Again, in the follow-up email, all of the links to these resources will be shared, so you can dive in and look further to find out what's happening within your state and where those opportunities for growth are. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters, our co-presenters. Chloe is going to take the lead to tell us more about the State Farm to School Policy Handbook.
Great, thanks so much, Lacey. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Chloe. I'm the policy specialist with the National Farm to School Network. And today we're going to talk along with Sophia and Esther from Vermont Law School to talk a little bit about the State Farm to School Policy Handbook. And you can head on to that next slide. All right, so just a little bit about the handbook. It is a project of the National Farm to School Network and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at the Vermont Law School. So we've been working on that together, and it's a project that's been funded by the National Agriculture Library at the USDA. So the exciting thing about this is it really is a guide that you can use to navigate state-level farm-to-school legislation in a variety of types, which we'll dig into to talk about the different kinds of legislation out there that's advancing farm-to-school objectives and goals in every state. We update the handbook every 2 years, meaning it's not updated in real time. So you may see some things in there that are not, that may be a little bit inaccurate or not updated, and it's because we're using the information that was available to us at the time. So our current handbook is covering legislative sessions from 2002 to 2018. So if something's changed in the past 6 months, it may not have made it in there just yet. But in the future, we're looking to make that much more responsive tool to be able to adapt to the sudden changes that always happen in policy. I can go to the next slide for me, Lacey. So when you're using this handbook, you can view it online. There's a PDF document, and we highly recommend going to our website, farmtoschool.org, to check that out. And you can download that and click through it and use it. There's a lot of different links in there that take you, you can search bills by jurisdiction, search them by different topics. You can go straight to case studies. And we also have a resource section where you can learn more and find a variety of different resources that we were able to reference for the tool. It's a great tool for your toolkit when you're working on farm to school policy. It informs state and federal policy, but it also informs you. It helps others states understand what might be able to work for them and what's worked in other states and what hasn't. We've included bills that didn't pass. We've included bills that are in process. So like I said, there's a variety there that you can take the time to learn from and really understand what's had success, what's been delayed, and what you can use at home. We also like to celebrate wins in the manual. So especially in these case studies, you'll find some really, we don't want to call them best practices, but some really exciting models that are happening out in the state levels, and see what people have really put the work into and what's really rising to the top to be successful. We also showcases what could potentially become best practices and gold standards for farm to school work. So while we don't necessarily point that out, there are some trends and patterns that you'll see and that we'll talk a little bit about today. So, and I'll pass it off to you, Esther, to talk about what's in the manual, or the handbook rather.
Oh, thank you. So what's new? The first thing that's new in the State Farm to School Policy Handbook is the reach. Starting in 2017, the National Farm to School Network expanded its work to include the U.S. territories. Therefore, in addition to the 50 states and the District of Columbia, the policy handbook includes farm to school policies from the U.S. territories, that is America and Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And also, whenever the term state is used generically during the webinar and in the handbook, it's intended to include the 50 states, DC, and the territories. The other thing that is new is the scope. This handbook takes a new narrowed approach. While the previous editions of this resource included any legislation that directly or indirectly impacted farm to school efforts, the 2017-2018 update takes a targeted look at legislation that directly and explicitly advances the core elements of farm to school and that is local procurement, school gardens, and food and agriculture education. An example, bills such as those funding food hubs would previously have been included because aggregation of local products for distribution is likely to benefit farm-to-school procurement efforts. However, with this new narrowed scope, unless such a bill explicitly acknowledges farm-to-school as a goal or a motivating factor, it was not included. The other thing is this resource takes on a new name. It changes from the State Farm-to-School Legislative Survey to the State Farm-to-School Policy Handbook, and the new name reflects the expansion of the information contained within this resource from only a survey compilation of state policies to the inclusion of case studies, best practices, analysis, and so much more. This slide talks about the 2002 to 2018 figures. So the success of the farm-to-school movement has resulted in the introduction of an increasing number of farm-to-school specific bills, and this has provided more data with which to compare and contrast farm-to-school approaches and trends. So from 2002 to 2018, a total of 453 farm-to-school bills and resolutions were introduced, and of those, 209 passed. The bar chart shows the breakdown between the numbers of farm-to-school bills proposed each year, but not passed, and the number of bills proposed that passed. While the line graph shows the number of cumulative total number of bills proposed and passed over time. A brief note about the legislative cycles is that most state legislatures meet annually, while some meet once in 3 years during odd-numbered years. So as a result, the total number of bills may vary from year to year depending on how frequently they meet. While not all states see a new legislature convene every 2 years, most of them do. As you can see from the graph, that the number of bills introduced in 2011, 2013, 2015, and 2017 are all much higher than the number of bills introduced in the subsequent years. This could partly explain why each odd year when the new legislature first convenes, there's generally a higher number of farm-to-school bills introduced than during the even year in the second year of the biennium. So based on this trend, it's expected that the 2019-2020 cycle will also reflect this same trend. Still in line with the narrowed scope, between January 1st, 2017 and December 31st of 2018, 32 states and the District of Columbia proposed 81 farm-to-school bills and resolutions, 25 of which passed. And each of these bills relate to at least one. The next slide, please. Yes, each of these bills relate to at least one of the core elements of farm-to-school. And for each of these 3 farm-to-school core elements, 50 bills related to local food procurement were proposed and 23 passed. 34 bills related to food and agriculture education were proposed and 10 of these passed, while 22 bills related to school gardens were proposed and 22 of these passed. Regarding bill types, the next slide, please. Yes, so regarding the bill types, this slide shows the most common bill types from between 2017 and 2018. And the highest number of bills introduced were appropriation bills, with 22 of these proposed and 11 passed. Grant programs had 18 such bills proposed and 7 of those passed. Promotional bills and resolutions with 17 proposed and 8 of those passed. Those are also a high number of food service worker training bills with 17 of these proposed and 8 passed. Sorry, food service worker training bills with 6 proposed and 4 passed, and then reimbursement bills with 3 proposed and all 3 passed. I think Sophia will take over from here.
Great. So the handbook also includes a discussion of the varying levels of political support and advocacy that are needed to pass a bill, depending on what the bill intends to do. And of course, there are many other factors that come into play given, the social, fiscal, the political nuances of each jurisdiction. So we're generalizing a bit here, based primarily on just our observation and anecdotal information. But in general, and probably unsurprisingly, where bills authorize money to accompany a program or a position, those types of bills are going to require the greatest amount of political support and therefore the greatest advocacy efforts to pass. Within funding bills, a bill that authorizes annual funding through the appropriations process each year may be easier to generate support for than bills that authorize permanent funding year after year. Legislation that makes it easier to purchase local products, so local preference laws, for example, those tend to take a moderate amount of political support and advocacy because those bills aren't authorizing new funding, but they are making changes to existing law, so they aren't entirely effortless. However, these types of bills can typically be characterized as a way to increase local economic development and put more money into the local economy, and that can make them attractive to both sides of the aisle and therefore potentially easier to pass. Similarly, bills that establish pilot programs also generally require a more moderate level of political support and advocacy because the funding they include tends to be limited by the scope and the duration of the pilot, and that can make them more appealing to a legislature. Bills that don't include any money typically require the lowest amount of political support and advocacy to pass. And legislation, for example, that establishes working groups, councils, or task forces typically require lower political support and advocacy. And they're not changing the way current law works. In general, they're setting up a council or a group that may look into and make recommendations about future actions that may or may not be taken. Proclamations generally require low political support and advocacy. Again, they're not including new money. They're not creating new law. Typically, they're just statements of support or encouragement that tend to come in the form of resolutions that can even be adopted by one or both chambers of the legislature and without the governor's signature. And we should note that even bills that don't require as much political or advocacy support to pass may still require a good amount of effort to implement or to implement well. But that is sort of another area of research that we're not getting into. Here, we're really focusing on the advocacy strategies needed to pass a bill. Next slide, please. So this map provides a visual of these farm-to-school laws introduced and passed between 2002 and 2018 based on this characterization of low to high political support and advocacy required. So it helps illustrate where different states have been successful in different levels of types of bills. So a few caveats, this only includes bills that passed. It does not include any bills that were introduced but didn't pass. It also doesn't reflect any local or community level activity or federal policy. So again, these are only state bills that passed. For the highest level of effort bills, it doesn't disaggregate the data by annual versus permanent funding. We're working now to reanalyze a lot of old data that will help us be more precise in the next iteration of analysis. But for now, funding bills are lumped together, regardless of whether it's annual one-year funding or multi-year funding. Specifically regarding farm-to-school coordinators, it only includes those coordinators that were created by the enactment of a bill. So there are some farm-to-school coordinator positions. The resource that Lacey mentioned identified a number of farm-to-school related positions across the country, but we were just focusing on those that were created by law. So they weren't created by an administration or even a nonprofit position or non-governmental position. So if you have any questions about the methodology behind this map, you can find the methodology as well in the handbook. It's the appendix to the handbook. And if you see something about your state that doesn't seem quite right, we certainly welcome feedback and would be happy to discuss this in more detail with you. But it just gives a sense of where bills or where states have been successful in passing some of these higher level political support and advocacy required bills. Next slide, please. And then building on this topic a bit more, the handbook also includes a deeper look at some legislative efforts and the advocacy strategies that went into enacting and implementing key initiatives through several state case studies. We looked at Hawaii, particularly we looked at the farm to school coordinator positions that are in both the agriculture and education departments. We looked at Michigan's 10 cents a meal reimbursement program. We looked at New Mexico, focusing on the New Mexico grown fresh fruit and vegetable purchasing program. We looked at the US Virgin Islands and their historic commitment to farm to school dating back to legislation from the early 90s, as well as current efforts to build collaborations and networks across the island. And in Vermont, we focused on the farm to school program and the systems approach that the state has taken, including recent legislative efforts that expanded the farm to school program to early care. And so a big thank you to all of the folks from those states who provided interviews and feedback on the case studies. We think these help dig into those advocacy strategies with just a lot more detail. And with that, we will turn it back to Chloe to wrap up.
Great, thank you so much, Sophie and Esther. That was really informative, and I hope that was informative for you all listening. So just on the last couple of slides here, we just wanted to dig a little bit into best practices when it comes to state policy. And these are just some things that rose to the top to be successful and impactful when it comes to advancing farm to school. So one of them is securing permanent funding. And what you'll see is a lot of folks go after annual appropriations, which are great, and they are a really strong starting point. But ultimately, we find that a permanent funding, that authorized year-to-year funding, is much more reliable than the annual appropriations, which year after year you have to advocate for, a lot more unstable, a lot less reliable. So permanent funding is oftentimes what you want to be shooting for. Next is identifying the motivation behind your bill. So ultimately, you really want to be explicit about acknowledging the motivations for a bill within that bill. So having a paragraph that states outright if you're looking to improve health outcomes or increase academic achievement. Maybe this is about local agricultural support, or maybe it's about advancing racial and social equity. But whatever that motivation may be, being very clear about that and including that in the bill language so that ultimately the purpose of that bill is maintained, especially when those edits are going about and when those drafts are going through, that you don't lose the ultimate spirit of the bill. And then finally, ensuring ongoing assessment and evaluation. So you want to make sure that this, whatever that bill may be, that it works, or that funding that it's doing what it was intended to do, and whatever tweaks and adjustments need to be made are made. So, and those things happen during assessment and evaluation. So building that into the legislation as well to ensure that it's either funded or that the space or staff or resources are allocated for that specific purpose. You can go to the next slide, please. And next we have some emerging opportunities. So some things that are also rising to the top of these farm to school conversations and kind of broadening the scope a little bit, universal meals and this opportunity to fund all of our in-school meals for children, make it much easier for school nutrition administrators to be able to procure locally, and even just making sure that more children are eating and that all of the benefits from healthy and well-fed children are coming out. So better health outcomes, better academic achievement, some of the things I mentioned before, and also just this idea of having a carve-out available for local foods, so requiring that a certain percentage of those foods are local and procured and supporting that local food system. So that's a conversation that's happening, being explored via federal legislation and the Child Nutrition Reauthorization, and especially via state legislative opportunities. And you'll see that in different incentive programs, but that's kind of the top tier idea that's out there, and probably one of the most ambitious is universal meals. And another opportunity emerging is farm to higher education. So when we talk about farm to school, we're typically talking about K through 12, or farm to early care. And farm to higher education is a conversation that's really starting to bubble up, and talking about how these large university and college systems, how they're procuring their food, and how they're what kind of impact that they're making on their local food system. So just two bits to think about when you're thinking about your farm to school legislation and how that can be impactful more widely across the board. And so just in conclusion, just a few thoughts to wrap up. So when you're using this handbook, please do, like Sophia mentioned, if you see something that needs to be changed, please do give us that feedback. And if you see things that there's something you wanted to see there that wasn't there, or something that needs changing, or just giving us a high five is great too, please do share that feedback. We want to see that, and we really want to make this a tool that works best for you, and that you can utilize to actually advance your policy goals in farm to school. Also, keep us updated on what's happening with state policy. I'm here to help you with that, or just to learn from all of the different states, so that we can elevate great ideas into federal policies. So keep contacting us and updating us on what's happening in your state. And finally, connect with other states to learn. That's what a network is about. It's really about connecting with each other. And we really want you to reach out to, if you see a state that has a really great program or bill or some legislative opportunity that you'd like to learn from, or to replicate in your state, please feel free to reach out to our national staff here at the National Farm to School Network, and we'll be happy to make those connections for you. And so if you have other questions or other ideas, please feel free to contact me. My phone number and email is up on the screen here. So again, if you have feedback, if you have questions, if you just want to say hello, I'm also here for that. So feel free to call or email.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe, Sophia, and Esther. What a great insight into these fantastic resources. If you have questions about any of these resources, please go ahead and enter those in the chat box. While we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, I want to share one last resource with you that we just released. And this is our Farm to School State of the State resource. And this really brings together the agendas and the opportunities that we've outlined in these three other resources to look at states that have fully integrated these three strategies at the state level. So the states that we've identified here have have a functioning farm to school network. They have at least one full-time farm to school position, whether that's in a state agency or university extension. And they also have at least one funded farm to school policy, whether that's for a grant program, a coordinated position, or an incentive program. So we want to lift up and celebrate these states that are really addressing all three of these strategies at the same time. And this really speaks to the opportunity for the integration and intersection of these three state strategies. So for instance, state level networks really increase the capacity for advocacy that can move state level policy. And those state farm to school positions can help support the coordination of networks. So we see a lot of opportunity for these compounding benefits and compounding opportunities as states integrate these three strategies. So we want to celebrate and lift up these states that have successfully integrated all three strategies, also recognizing that many states are doing incredible work at the same time. So we feature lots of other states and their successes within each of those individual documents as well. So again, all of these resources will be shared with you via email and a follow-up email with links to all of these resources. And we open up the line now for questions. If you have questions about any of these resources or in-depth questions about the concepts shared within these resources, whether that's creating state networks or state positions or policy at the state level, please feel free to enter those in that chat box. And I'll get us started with some questions for Chloe and Sophia and Esther. One question I have for you, you mentioned the idea of kind of a gold standard of policy. Can you give an example of what you see as that gold standard of policy that states should be working towards?
I see. I can take that and then hand it to Sophia and Esther. So one, like I mentioned before, the permanent funding piece, I can't, and nothing comes up to mind immediately, but aiming for that permanent funding for a farm to school program, whether that be an incentive or a coordinator position or, whatever is the need in your state, aiming for permanent funding as opposed to annual appropriations, I think is really one of the things we can solidly say is a best practice, just because the funding is stable when it's permanent. It also does typically take the most advocacy and political will, but definitely something that's worth it when you're not having to come back year after year for funding that's up for question every year. It's something that's just there, and it shows a commitment on behalf of the state to farm to school, and says that this is something we believe needs to be embedded in the institutions.
Great, thank you, Chloe. I think that's really helpful to think about as states consider what's they want to be aiming for. Along the same lines, you know, I think when we look at those state policies and we look at the number of state policies enacted versus the number that have been proposed, what do you see as an important factor in bridging that gap and moving the number of enacted policies closer to the number of proposed policies?
Sophia and Esther, I think you guys might be able to answer that question better than I can.
Sure, we could give it a shot. I mean, I think that in many cases, it's really dependent on what's happening in that particular state and sort of the purpose behind the bill. And in some states, we just see really active legislatures and advocacy groups that are getting a number of bills introduced year after year. And sometimes, it's helpful to think about the motivation. You know, sometimes the first time you introduce a bill, you aren't necessarily doing it because you think it's going to pass. You're doing it because you want to start to bring attention to an issue, start to see who else out there might support it. And so sometimes it may take several rounds of introducing a bill before you get it over the finish line anyway, just because it can take that amount of time to build support. And so some of the case studies, I think, provide some more insights into how to be effective in getting some of those bills over the finish line. And many of them center around the idea of building strong networks of supporters across your state that you can then bring into a lot of those advocacy discussions and garnering really strong supporters within the legislature. And so, it's iterative in many ways. And I think that's something that is definitely came out through, in large part through the conversations related to the case studies, is just developing those networks, having strong baseline of support, and understanding that it just may take a few times before you get a bill to pass, and may require some tweaks to the language. And you see that in the handbook as well, as you're sort of scrolling through all of the different bills that have been introduced, the small changes that have been made to bills over the years as they've been introduced before finally reaching something that works and gets passed. So some of it's trial and error, and a lot of it is just building that base of support.
Thank you, Sophia. I think that's really important, and I think it demonstrates that linkage between these strategies as well. Recognizing what the opportunities are with building and developing these networks of stakeholders who can work at different levels of capacity building and advocacy and policy advocacy. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you're building those partnerships, and who can take part in that advocacy approaches, and who needs to be a part of that network development.
If I can add just one more thought, Lacey, just on that also, and this reflects back on one of the other sort of trends or best practices that Chloe mentioned related to assessment and evaluation. I think another way that states have been successful in getting bills enacted is being able to come in with some of the data and the economic argument for enacting a particular bill or putting in place a particular program, and that you're able to provide that justification to the legislature if you have a strong system for collecting data on the need and particularly local economic development and those impacts. And so thinking about the comprehensive view of what it is that you're trying to do and bringing those economic arguments and that data to the fore, I think can also be really effective.
Thank you, Sophia. That's wonderful. And that's an area that National Farm to School Network is certainly keeping our eyes and focus on. We have worked with some partners to look more closely at what are the economic impacts of farm to school programs at a broader scale, and certainly would love to be able to support states in honing in on what that information is. And that leads us to a question from one of our audience members. They say that the USDA farm-to-school census data is now outdated. Are there any other best practices for collecting state-level data similar to what the tool captured in the past? And I can mention to this attendee that the USDA farm-to-school census will be happening again later this year. So we will be garnering more of that information very soon. And I will also say that many states are working to collect that state-level data on their own. So I think connecting with your state agencies and connecting with your state partners, many of whom are listed on the National Farm to School Network website as our core and supporting partners, they can give you a sense of what data is being captured in your state through other mechanisms. But that USDA Farm to School census data will soon be updated, and I think that's really a valuable source of information to better understand district level, state level, and national level practices and implications. So Chloe or Sophia and Esther, do you have any other thoughts on that data collection?
I do not.
Well, I would just add that in the compilation of all of the state legislation, that is something that we were analyzing for, whether there was some sort of requirement to collect data and report on it. And in the next iteration of this analysis that Chloe mentioned, we're working to create a system where it can be a little bit more searchable online and created in a more updated in a more real-time fashion. One of the things that we are analyzing for is that evaluation piece. And so we will be able to put out some of that information, to be able to guide some of that. But I think that one of the challenges that comes up is that even in bills where you see language around reporting, there isn't always a funded position that is the person that is sort of intended to be doing that data collection and reporting. And so thinking about those pieces hand in hand when you're putting together a bill that might create some sort of data collection and reporting mechanism within the state, does it also ensure that there's enough funding for that agency to be able to carry out that mandate?
Great point, Sophia. I think that's so important to think about building in all of those components to be funded, and building in that evaluation and assessment of reach can really, I think, enhance the longevity, being able to demonstrate what that reach and impact is. So thank you for pointing that out as another kind of key promising practice as folks think about what legislation can and should look like at the state level. Great questions. We don't have any other questions from the audience. Thank you for all of you who are here. I want to again reiterate what Chloe mentioned, that we are constantly looking to update and gather the best information around what's happening across the country. So again, we are not updating these in real time, but we will have new and upcoming iterations. So if you find that there are new advances within your state, whether that comes to creating a network or creating new positions or new policy enacted, please keep us updated on that, and we'll be sure to catalog it and make sure that's included in our next iterations. We know that this work changes quickly, and so we want to keep our pulse on what's happening at that state level, because we know that having that correct information can really help propel the work within other states as well. And these are really valuable opportunities for us to be learning from one another and best practices across states. So I want to leave it open to our other presenters. Is there any closing comments or anything you want to share?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button for a second. I think the thing I would just want to reiterate is that we really do want the feedback, and we also want to celebrate your wins with you and strategize around what we can do to help support future policy efforts, maybe that didn't go through this year the way you planned, or just making them better and stronger, and be advocates alongside you and learn from you. So please do keep in touch, even if it's just a random email. I get random strings of thoughts all the time. So feel free to share what's on your mind and what you're thinking state policy wise that either we can be supportive of or just talk through ideas that are going to help advance the work.
Thank you, Chloe. Sophia and Esther, any closing comments?
No, nothing else, just that it's been a real pleasure to work with National Farm to School Network on this project. And we are also happy to receive any feedback or thoughts that any of you have on how to make this a better resource.
Esther here. It was nice to work on the survey. It took a couple of months, but getting to know the formidable work that everyone out there is doing is really great. And in case there's any feedback that is out there, please do communicate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for our panelists for joining us and for their partnership in the creation of these resources. And thanks to all of you for spending your afternoon with us. Again, you'll be receiving a follow-up email with the link to the recording, as well as links to all of the resources that we discussed and links to register for any of our upcoming webinars. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to having you join us on a webinar again soon. Have a great afternoon.